his Dick, so I will. He's written a large and impressive collection of books and articles on a variety of topics, most of which relate to the history and agriculture of the inland Pacific Northwest. A number of books are here on display. Bill Woodward was kind enough to check a lot of books out from Seattle Pacific University, and you'll see on your centerpiece reproductions of the covers of quite a few of his books. Many of his books they include Chief Kamiakin, The Life and Legacy of the Northwest Patriot, The Snake River Palouse and the Invasion of the Inland Northwest, Celebrating Palouse Country, A History of Landscape and Text and Imagery, Hardship to Homeland, Pacific Northwest Volga Germans, and Harvest Heritage, Agricultural Origins and Heirloom Crops of the Pacific Northwest. Now, of course, history is replete with people who've written all sorts of things, and then the question is any of it any good? And in Dick's case, his colleagues believe that they're all very good, and many others agree. Harvest Heritage was described by Columbia Magazine as a book rich in both text and imagery that explores the people, history, and major influences that shaped and transformed the Pacific Northwest flourishing agricultural economy, from Spanish exploration to modern research and advancements in mechanization, seed quality, irrigation, and sustainable practices. In 2020, Pacific Historical Review reported that Hardship to Homelands focus on the details of Volga-German colonial experience, coupled with a focus on story and culture, make it an excellent volume for the classroom and a must-read for historians of Pacific Northwest. So that's our assignment tonight. Go home, get the book, read up. Regarding the Snake River Palouse and the invasion of the Inland Northwest, which Dick co-wrote with Clifford Trafzer, the American Indian Quarterly praised it for retelling the compelling saga of Western expansion and Indian white conflict from a Native American perspective in a solid and sometimes eloquent fashion, allowing the reader to know this politically vulnerable people. The Guild's trustees agree with all of these opinions, and that's why we're here tonight. Dick Scheuerman was born and raised in his family's farm between Endicott and St. John, Washington. Most of you have never heard of them, but they're still there. They're all in Whitman County. He's a 1973 graduate of Washington State University, where he earned a BA in History and Education. In 1974, he was awarded a diploma in Russian at the Defense Language Institute, during which students study a foreign language 5 days a week, 7 hours a day, and in some cases up to 64 weeks. 3 years later, he received an MA degree in history from Pacific Lutheran University, and in 1992, people started referring to him as Dr. Scheuerman, after he received his PhD in educational leadership at Gonzaga University. After serving for many years as a teacher and administrator in Washington Public Schools, in 2005, he joined the faculty of Seattle Pacific University, where he was an associate professor of education. During his long teaching career, Dick Scheuerman has been recognized with a number of awards, including the Washington Governor's Award for Excellence in Teaching, the Rupert Costo, I always want to say Costco, but it's Costo Medallion for Excellence in American Indian Research and Teaching, and an Excellence in Education Award from the Washington State Association for Supervision and Curriculum Development. His writings have not been limited to books. It seems most appropriate that one of his many published articles appeared in a journal called Teaching with Compassion, Competence, and Commitment. I've heard it said of Dick. Since 2014, he's been the co-founder and president of Palouse Heritage, which began a quest to identify, study the nutritional benefits, and revive production of the Northwest's first grain crop varieties, and to promote heritage and health through wholesome farm produce and cultural resources related to these nutritious and flavorful heritage grains. And if you don't believe that it is producing things, Bill Woodward has a package of the pancake mix that they produce. He's not living a quiet life of retirement, so we're very pleased that he could join us tonight so we could gather and honor him for his many achievements to date. So now, Dick, you get to come up. I'm going to give you the award, and then we're going to hear from Dick. And let's see, Ben is our photographer. Do you need the lights up?
Okay, I got it right here.
Right there.
Right there.
And if you haven't seen this, we had it on display, but it says Washington and the Great Pacific Northwest, including scholarly works on Native American history and culture, notably of the Palouse people and Chief Kamai and his people, German pioneers in the region, agrarian themes in art and literature, and heirloom grains. That's quite it. No? So, there you are.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you all for being here this evening. This is like a reunion for me, and there's scarcely a person here in the name that I don't owe something significant to. And I aspire to keep to the 15-20 minute time limit, but apart from just reading a long list of encyclopedic names that would consume that much time, for those of you suffering from insomnia, I have brought copies of the King James Version of my remarks that you're welcome to take home with you. I'm going to stick to the high points, and if you care to see those other details, I did bring copies, and you're welcome to have those. As I said, this is something of a reunion for me. There are people throughout this room that have had great significance in my life, and I would not be here were it not for them. Great colleagues, military historians at large, with Bill Woodward and Rob Styling from Seattle Pacific University, who greatly enriched my perspectives. Many of you members of the Guild here, I will mention some. A great artist friend here, Jim Gerlitz, who's illustrated some of my works, and you'll see an example of that at some point. This is, boy, thank you, Elizabeth, for coordinating that. That's Jim's view of Ekaterina Kaisarina, the Catherine the Great of Russia, and a very special moment in our family's history that Jim put pen to paper and illustrated. We're also in the presence of a man I consider the wisest person I've ever met. His name is Arthur Ellis, and he's in the back center table. He's a man for all seasons, and I'm deeply grateful for his influence in my life. Thank you, Arthur and Masha, for being with us. So thank you, President Jim, the Guild's Award Committee, for this kind expression. I've known about this organization for a long time and have attended the meetings at the library and elsewhere downtown from time to time over years. So many here have enriched my life, and I look at that roster of members: Dave McAndry, Gwen Whitey, Bryce Nelson here, John Finley, the late Ruth Kirk, and Esther Mumford, many others. I first met Esther in 1988 as a member of the Washington Centennial Commission's Ethnic Heritage Committee. Thanks to contributing historians like her, along with Sid and Pat White and Carlos Keel, we launched the People's Project that yielded the Peoples of Washington book and Living Treasures Award program, for which many of you here tonight, by the way, I think are qualified. It lives on to this day in annual recognition sponsored by the Northwest Folklight Festival. Speaking of cultural influences, highlighting the significance of our work here, I confess to some influence as committee chair in the selection of our state's very first living treasure, Columbia Plateau Tribal Elder Andrew George. After receiving his award here in Seattle, before a large crowd in the shadow of the Space Needle, I pushed him back to the family's car in a wheelchair. "Andrew, what a special day," I said. "You visited with the governor. You're going to be on TV tonight, and so much more. What do you think was the best part of the day?" Andrew pointed skyward with his cane and said, "There was a bird up up in that tree. I'd never heard that song before. I was greatly blessed to have been raised in a community immersed in history and folk life, to have had friends like Andrew. My first memory of boyhood inquiry into our family's past prompted my grandfather, Carl Scheuerman, to tell me about someone he called the Kaiserina Katharina. His reference to Imperial Russia and Catherine the Great spurred my youthful imagination. Grandpa spoke of her with such familiarity that I wondered if we might all be blue bloods. That Her Imperial Highness invited our ancestors to immigrate eastward from war-torn 18th century Hesse to a new Volga homeland seemed otherworldly. Hessians only got play in our school textbooks as villains fighting with the British Allies during the Revolutionary War. My beloved wife Lois, who is here with me tonight and on these many adventures, we had grown up on farms in the vicinity of Endicott, Washington, a tiny hamlet tucked away in the Palouse Hills. Not only have we known each other our entire lives, but our grandparents came from the same Volga village over a century ago, Yagodnaya Polyana, Berry Meadow, and their ancestors lived side by side since departing their Hessian homeland in the summer of 1766. My good friend Jim's ancestors came from the same village. Many of Uzielites, our people, have lived in close proximity to each other ever since, and I thank Lois and the families of our daughters and sons, Mary Kay and Charles, Carl and Sarah, Leanna. Don't worry, we'll find out. I'm not missing anybody. And my brother Don's daughter, Nicole, who's with us here, teacher of history here in the West Side. I'm grateful for my sisters, Debbie and Diane. My mother, Mary, thanks Elizabeth for this wonderful program on events happening 100 years ago, right now. My mother turns 100 in 1 week. She was a Rosie the Riveter and could have helped out maybe on these planes, although it was a few years later. Evidence of history appreciation in the next generation is especially heartwarming for a historian parent. Our Mary teaches middle school social studies in Richland, where she has worked with me to formulate the interdisciplinary Journeys of Discovery curriculum. Son Carl is a Washington Air National Guard officer who led military history field trips from Fairchild and Joint Base Lewis McChord. Leanna, our daughter here this evening, has facilitated travels to Eastern Europe, many aspects of the agrarian history harvest project we've had underway for these past years. It's a family endeavor, and I'm so grateful for them for supporting my work. They know that for many years and reasons beyond my ken, the Muse has made demands upon my time, usually about 10 p.m. till 2 in the morning. These appointments often postpone more pressing next day labors like mowing the lawn and changing the oil that too often fell upon other shoulders. At many a mealtime, as many may well know in your households, one might hear, "He's where? Doing what today?" Last month, for example, I visited Egypt and Tokyo. No, not those familiar ones. The Columbia Basin country crossroads by those names, where immigrant families like ours once gathered to harvest grain, give worshipful thanks, and marvel at evening quail song. Despite the devotion to my grandfather and his stories of Katharina, in later years of college skepticism, it struck me highly unlikely that any forlorn former farmer relative ever got close enough to Empress Catherine's Winter Palace in St. Petersburg to see so much as a window pane or stroll down the Kremlin stone streets. Permit me to tell you here that subsequent years of research have proven, in fact, they did. Still later, I struggled to learn the languages they spoke, and I eventually visited these grand locations many times, as well as ancestral villages in Germany and along the Volga. In these places, our stalwart forebears variously struggled and thrived and moved on yet again. Some to America, to Argentina, to Canada, to Kazakhstan, and beyond. During the 1990s, I carried back 10,000 pages of documents from newly accessible Russian archives to shed light on Catherine and Tsar Alexander's historic campaigns of foreign settlement in the Volga and Ukraine, and about events under the reigns of their Romanov successors that led many Eastern Europeans to immigrate. For much of the past century, and in many places around the world, having Russian or German backgrounds has not been popular. To be designated both as an amalgam that has sometimes carried additional burdens, as well as cultural opportunity for inquiry. My grandfather's tales of the Kaiserina prompted a self-appointed teenage mission to interview all first-generation immigrants from Russia and Germany who inhabited our rural Palouse country communities. I extended that visit to others in Walla Walla, Ritzville, and Odessa. The first people who settled in the 1880s, before railroad construction facilitated travel to the region, had come by wagon. Here they encountered a landscape of fertile undulating hills that may have called forth some ancestral association with the rolling Hessian-Vogelsberg district or the Volga-Bergsieta hilllands. On the Great Columbia Plain of the inland Pacific Northwest, they found dense bunchgrass, scattered pines, encountered traveling bands of indigenous peoples. As a boy, I wondered who they were, where they were, relatives left behind, strewn from the Volga across Central Asia to Siberia, like seeds cast to the wind. And who were those Columbia Plateau First Peoples who had traded Snake River salmon for Mrs. Aschenbrenner's biscuits at the Volga-German Palouse colony, just over the hill from where I was raised on our farm home? I found enigmatic reference to names like Chief Kamayakan, Wolf Necklace, the Appaloosa horse breeder Sam Fisher. Their names appeared in books on regional heritage, authored by Okanagan Judge W.C. Brown, Yakima historian L.V. McWhorter, and Ellensburg rancher A.J. Splon. As an undergrad at WSU, I devoured history classes by Thomas Pesek on Russia, Fred Duman on Europe, David Stratton on the American West, but there was no such program as public history in the late 60s and early 70s in Pullman. Through good people like those gathered here, I was enabled to continue the work in oral histories and regional research, and these form the basis of the books Pilgrims on the Earth, others that Jim mentioned in his kind introduction. Most recently, a 3-volume Harvest Project series, and Celebrating Palouse Country paid tribute to stunning words by Polish anthropologist Józefa Dejda-Kozika that I used for Harvest Horizon's introductory epigram. Quote, "Harvest since time immemorial was understood in ritual terms as the principal duty in humanity's relationship with Mother Earth for the perpetuation of life. This was essentially the purpose of existence. Principal duty for the perpetuation of life." I've been awestruck by that statement ever since I encountered it. We live in a day where much is said about responsibility for earth care. And now in our time of climate change and partisanship, there are many threats to these positive interventions. A common farewell expression Lois and I heard as young people growing up among our first generation Volga German immigrants was adieu. But the word is not likely from their relic Hessian dialect. I was told by a community elder that the word probably is a remnant from the half-dozen Grande Armée prisoners of war who were sent to live among our people after Napoleon's catastrophic 1812 Russian campaign. We know that the forlorn soul survivors included some French-speaking members of the Lorraine community near France who may well have contributed the loan words like adieu that over time became the adieu spoken by locals and their descendants here in the Pacific Northwest. Tolstoy's War and Peace mixes fictional narrative with events of the Napoleonic Wars, and a scene near Smolensk relates the psychology of response to challenging times. Peasants and nobles of Prince Andrei Bolkonsky's estate ponder their fates in the wake of invasion. While Bolkonsky serves in the Russian army, his sister Maria seeks help from the family's serfs to escape eastward. But her offer of grain from their reserve with prospect of safety in Moscow falls on deaf ears. Both sides pillage crops en route to the capital that will soon fall to flame, and Tolstoy pauses to consider the general public's reaction. Quote, "The approach of the enemy did not make the citizens at all more serious. On the contrary, their levity seemed to increase as their position became more critical, as often happens on the eve of catastrophe. In fact, at such a juncture, two voices are heard. One wisely preaches the necessity for estimating fairly the impending danger and the means at hand for resisting it. The other argues that the thought is too painful, since it's not given to man to escape the inevitable, and that it is better, therefore, to forget the danger, live merrily till it comes. Solitary men listen to the first, while the masses obey the second." If contemporary mass media accurately reflects public sentiment, considerable levity and febrile complaint presently reigns in our popular culture. Prominent partisan voices are preoccupied with matters of the moment, while some religious leaders seem obsessed with end times theology, instead of the terrestrial and climatic perils to peace and a renewable staff of life. The work of historians like you, worth their salt, can have salutary effect. The characters who inhabit Tolstoy's stories have heroic capacity, even when cast as loners and unpopular. They walk familiar paths to work together in the fields to better understand the people and world around them. Amidst our happy fellowship this evening as guild members, I hope we continue to better understand, to share those understandings in ways that provide practical benefits to readers and hearers, and appreciate the beauty of birdsong along the way. Thank you.
Anybody have any questions? Two things. If you have questions, you can ask them now, or you could, or we have desserts and food still here, and we have the room until about 10 minutes, 8:45, something like that. So we have plenty of time to enjoy good company.
revolution, the communists?
It was actually much earlier. It was when Catherine the Great brought them in, she issued a series of privileges under what was called the Manifesto of the Empress. So, freedom of religion, no taxes, no service in the Russian military, and no schooling in Russian schools. They could have their own church tradition, their own language, no taxes. That continued for nearly a century. And her successor said, a century is eternity. And in 1870, Tsar Alexander passed a series of restrictions that began drafting the Germans living on the Volga into the army, and required young males to learn Russian, and also began taxing these people. The combination of all those factors at the same time, coincident with the opening of the American West, where transcontinental railroads coming in the 1870s, 1880s offered opportunities here to acquire land, new opportunity. They were a very prolific bunch, lots of Berlitzes and Scheuermans and Moraxes over there. And so over that century, land availability had become a problem. These were an overwhelmingly agrarian people. And so in the 1870s, they began looking for other opportunities. And the first came here to the Northwest in 1881. And Odessa, Washington was named for Ukraine, Odessa, Ukraine. I mentioned being in Tokyo the other day. That's just a few miles from a little bird elevator called Betun. I can't remember, I think Betun is maybe in Armenia. Anyway, there are a lot of these places in eastern Washington where these German families clustered, and that's why they started coming. By about 1950, about 100,000 were living here in the Pacific Northwest, first and second generation. So it was a substantial migration.
Related question. I've long wondered what percentage of the Volga, Deutsch, and the other German communities actually got out before World War II.
Yeah, good question. I can't give you an exact number, but substantial. I just quickly, I would say probably close to half.
Oh, that's good news.
When World War I began, the borders closed, and that began a very, I was going to say tragic, that's too light of a word, catastrophic series of events. The war in 1928, the war on the church that Stalin launched. These were very devout people. And the collectivization campaign, they were all branded kulaks because they had livestock and animals. So many of them were deported to Central Asia and Siberia. Before the 1941 mass exile to that part of the world. Collectivization, as I said, the war on the church, the great famines of the late 20s and early 30s. These people just got hit time and time again with horrendous events. By the fall of 1941, much like we created internment camps in this country, as we know, for Japanese Americans here in the region, Stalin considered all these tens of thousands of Germans that had lived there for over 150 years enemies within. In fact, they were formerly called spies and divisionists. And so the entire Volga nation, not well known, was packed up, many of them murdered, and the quote nation as a whole was deported to Kazakhstan and the Russian Far East and Siberia. So today, that's where a lot of our relatives live, and it took some doing to track them down. But over time, we've been able to make connections with them and learn the stories of what they dealt with.
And on that last point you're just making there, I've also been curious that many of the descendants of the Volga and other Deutsch communities have become, they've been, they've lost for a generation or two the language,
Yes.
but they came back to Germany by the thousands, I guess, if not tens of thousands
Yes.
in the 1980s, 90s.
Right.
And have any of them ever showed up in the U.S.?
Yes,
Or the
yeah,
West?
yeah. Some have come here to the Northwest. We've hosted them in our home. It's an interesting, phenomenon in the peoples of Central Asia and the Far East. And so when the German Federal Republic of Germany allowed them to establish German citizenship in the late 1980s and 1990s, many thousands came and depopulated their villages in Central Asia and the Far East. The adjustment to life in Germany has been very difficult. These people have been studied by anthropologists and linguists because they live in a way and speak in a way as if you're in the 18th century Hessian environment. And as you know, Germany and Western Europe has become a very liberal democracy, and I liken it sort of to us looking, Appalachian Hill people, and moving to Seattle and thinking they're just going to fit right in, and they don't. And so they have established their own communities within the communities throughout Germany, and have their own associations, and there continues to be some tension. But as we know, with the developments in Russia under Putin, they appreciate the fact that, yeah, they have freedoms here that they never would have known in the old world.
Thanks.
Right.
That's the last question. You get the honor. No, you get the honor of the last one.
Well, I guess my real question is, I'm not clear on what the original benefit or occasion or motivation of Catherine was in the first place.
Yeah.
What need was she meeting? And then why Germans? Why not,
Yes.
I don't know, Finnish or...
Yeah, great question, yeah. Kind of a push-pull thing. On the push, there was economic devastation in Central Europe in the 1750s, 1760s. So their counterpart to the French Indian War, there had been all this conflict back and forth between Protestants and Catholics, and the princes of Hesse were looking for some money, and Catherine offered financial inducements to the houses of Hesse and people coming to her country, because on the Pole side, she had just won vast territories on the lower Volga and Ukraine from the Turks. And she was looking for people who would be dependable colonists. She herself, as you know, was German. However, what is not widely known, and hence I think of your awareness of this, Rod, that even though the history is woven deeply as a German story, she actually did try to recruit people from Holland, people from France. She sent her agents all over Europe. But many rulers in those regions were much more protective of their tax base, and they shut down the immigration campaign. But it really took fire in those areas north of Frankfurt, in what we call the Vogelsberg district, where the rulers were sympathetic to this because they were getting paid off by some of her agents. And so between about 1755 and 1770, 27,000 made it out. By World War I, that had grown to over 1.5 million. So yeah, it was a big number. By the way, many of them were considering at that time themselves to be loyal members of the Russian nation, even though, of course, they were anti-Bolshevik. But they weren't really politically active. And so they got caught in this tension, you know, between Russia and Germany. And as I said, in 1941, Stalin just wrote the entire, it basically extinguished the nation by decree, gave them 2 weeks to pack up, and they were all sent by trains then to Central Asia and the Russian Far East. And that's where a lot of them remained until, like Robert ended, many of them then came to Germany in just the last several decades. So they formed their own communities there and are a vital part of the nation, but also, you know, a lot of these social issues that they face trying to become integrated to modern society. Again, thanks for the questions. This is a fascinating topic that isn't often explored, and very timely today with a lot of the contests going on in Ukraine and Russia, and we really hope for a favorable resolution. Thank you.